depression and faith. What is depression in God's lens in a biblical sense? Because on one side, a lot of people say, it's just a clinical thing, it's just purely medical. On the other side, people say it's a spiritual thing, just pray harder, just have more faith. And so if you are going through depression yourself, we just want you to know you are not alone. We hope this is a safe space where you can really feel seen and known and validated in your experience. And on the other side, if you know somebody with depression or experiencing depression in your life and you want to help them, we hope that this gives you a better understanding of it and a better grasp on what it actually is and how you could also help better support them as a loved one or a friend. Before we get started, we want to ask you, if you haven't yet, follow us on Instagram @WithTheTrans. We are running a very exciting book giveaway with our podcast guest from last week, Natasha Smith, talking about healthy grieving and what that looks like and what that means for our everyday lives. It ends this Friday, so make sure, if you haven't yet, to enter the giveaway on our Instagram. And let's get into today's episode.
Hey friends, welcome back to the pod. Today we have a really deep topic, and this one has been one of the most, if not the most, requested topic, and we are going to talk about depression as a Christian. We don't really talk about it too much in church, and I think it's just something that we felt like we should talk about. We also want to be authentic too, because we've also had our own struggles with depression too. So we're not high and mighty and our life is just sunshines and rainbows, but we have our own set of challenges as well. But at the end of the day, just want to create a safe space for our listeners, our viewers, and just to really connect with all of you, our friends, and to have this space that we can talk about this.
Yeah, because I feel like most people struggle with it secretly or privately because, it doesn't come up naturally in conversation at
Yeah.
parties or, whatever gatherings you have. So when we talk about this topic, we want to just show compassion and empathy for everyone who may struggle with something similar, or maybe you don't even know if it is depression. And we'll talk a bit about, what it is and how, as believers, we can better understand it. First, before we get into the meat of things, make sure you are subscribed to our email list, because this is exactly where we'll be posting even more ideas and polls and opportunities to actually vote. So you as the listener and the viewer can vote for the topics that we talk about, which is amazing. We want to create that engagement with you, and ultimately we don't want to just talk about whatever we want to talk about. We want to talk about things that will be helpful for you and valuable for you and will help you grow in your walk with Jesus. And so if you're not already subscribed, the link is in our description, and we want to get you on there so you don't miss out on opportunities like this.
Okay, back to our scheduled programming. I will also say that I feel like as Asian Americans, or just I guess Asians in general, we don't really talk about emotional health, let alone depression.
It's so stigmatized and seen as what is that? Why would you care about that?
Yeah, my parents definitely didn't talk about it, but a lot of our listeners are Asian or Asian American. They can probably relate to.
Regardless of whatever background it is, it's
Yeah.
if you didn't grow up in a home that normalized it, you naturally feel like, is something wrong with me, or what's going on? Because we've just never been taught, how to understand this, especially through the lens of faith and how everything integrates together.
Yeah.
So
definitely. We want to start off pretty open and honest with all of you, just by sharing our own personal experiences. So I will say that depression looks differently for everyone. Everyone has their own unique journeys and experiences, and there's no shame or judgment with that at all. Even the most godly people can experience depression as well. I will also add a disclaimer that we are not clinical psychologists. We're not medically trained at all. So this episode is just purely to share what we've gone through and just have an open discussion about this. And one thing that we'll talk about is just some of the myths around depression as well, and how we can look at depression through a Christian lens. My earliest memory and experience of depression actually happened in high school. I didn't really have language to even describe how I was feeling. I was just feeling super down and empty and just emo, I guess is the word, the high school word to use, especially around sophomore year and junior year of high school, kind of on the beginning end of senior year too. So actually pretty much my whole high school life, I will leave names anonymous, but let's just say I fell in love with this girl, ended up being rejected. I felt betrayed by a friend. And it was mainly because I've never really experienced like a sense of love from my parents. I knew they loved me. Like looking back, I know they love me. But at the time, as a 16, 17-year old, it just, I don't know, it just felt like high pressure Asian family environment. And I just felt like love was conditional. But when
Right.
I
Or you were like looking for a kind of expressed love that wasn't being expressed in a certain way for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I found this with this girl in high school, but I got rejected. I felt betrayed, and I just felt super empty for sophomore year, junior year of high school. And so because of all that and the feeling of emptiness, I actually had like suicidal thoughts where I never really like went through with anything, but I definitely had ideation and ways to like, like ways to do it, which led to like a decline in my grades. I eventually didn't get into the colleges that I wanted to just because my grades weren't up there. I was super out of it with extracurriculars. I don't think I ate very well either. I mean, I wasn't really mindful of what I was eating. I was just coasting through life. I was trying my best. But I couldn't shake it off. I just remember like going to class, and when I would see these people that kind of triggered me, I would just feel like a sharp like knife in my chest, figuratively. It was really awful. Like these people who were involved with like the rejection and the betrayal, we shared a lot of classes together, and when I would see them, it was super hard. I just remember clearly like I was crying out for help a lot. Back then in high school, we had something called AOL Instant Messenger or AIM, where I would literally, and I think I realized that a lot of people did this, but for me, it was actually a cry for help. I would post song lyrics on my AIM
Away message.
away message, like very depressive songs, like from Simple Plan, Green Day, and all that
I feel
stuff.
like so many. I did that too, but you're saying it was like another level for you.
Mine actually had meaning to it. Like I was actually crying out for help, and I didn't know how because my parents never really addressed it. It's just like suck it up. Why are you crying? Why are you sad? Eventually, I did get out of it. I don't know. I don't really know how I got out of it. But I did get out of it eventually at the back half of senior year of high school, going into college.
Can you break that, like, get into that a bit more? Like, you said you don't know how, but like, did something happen or like a series of things happen? Like, what do you remember helped lead you there? Maybe it wasn't one thing, but like
Mm, it's hard to pinpoint time, and then also I just did things that I enjoyed. Like for me, I did track in high school, so track was a big source of just, yeah, it was like an outlet too, and I just hung out with friends more. And senior year, I just felt like I feel more liberated. Like, yeah, we have senioritis, but at the same time, I didn't really care because I was gonna go to community college, and then I just kind of did things I enjoyed a bit more.
so like something in you switched in terms of instead of like focusing on all the bad things that you were focusing on, you were like, I have nothing else to lose, so
It's
might
it's
as well just live
it's
my life.
yeah, it's super hard to just pinpoint to something. I really don't know. Like, I really don't know. I can say time. I wasn't Christian at the time either, actually. So
It was God's
I
grace.
it was definitely God's grace.
Yeah,
But
because sometimes people struggle with it. Even I agree, time helps, but there are people who struggle with mental health issues for decades or like their whole life, and they would probably disagree. Like time heals everything. So I feel like there must have been
yeah,
something. Maybe you don't even know, like spiritually or emotionally, or maybe something in your family that like helped you kind of switch mentally, or
yeah,
God in
I
your
I
life.
actually really don't know. I wish I could say I did ABC and this happened.
Yeah,
It
sometimes we
wasn't
don't know.
really like that at
Yeah.
all. It was more gradual. It wasn't like a change like that.
Praise
Yeah.
God for his freedom. Yeah, for me, I definitely can relate to that a lot. Like in terms of, especially in high school, I would say, I also kind of a side note, but I feel like media also like dramatizes life for you as a kid when you grow up. So I remember even in middle school, I would have these like very, now looking back, it's like, why did I, spiral in those ways? But I would like have these mental spirals a lot of times. And looking back, I feel like it connects a lot with like what I saw in movies or media of like, oh, how come everyone's so happy? happy and they have friends or they're like in a dating relationship. And you just like have this unrealistic expectation of what life should be like when you don't have, someone or a community around you like recalibrating your mental, emotional, spiritual health. It's like you just think, oh, that is what looks normal in the movies. And if my life doesn't look like that, I'm like really miserable or I'm a loser or something.
Actually, what you just said kind of triggered something that actually helped with my depression, and it's actually friends. The person that I felt betrayed by, he actually came up to me and he apologized, which was very. I think now, as I'm even
Real
processing,
time
real time
processing.
processing with you, I felt like I harbored this resentment so much in my heart. Like I really hated him. Like it
Yeah,
was, I felt backstabbed. He was like
right.
one of my closest friends, and he just like
Wow.
backstabbed me.
Yeah.
And man, I'm like kind of blocking that out of my memory, but I actually think he kind of broke up with that girl because of me, which I think
Because he felt
really
so bad about it.
he felt bad. But I think what was most freeing is that he just apologized.
Dang.
So then,
Powerful.
yes, I don't know if I forgave him. Like, did I even know the word forgiveness at the time? I'm not sure, but I think
Yeah.
there was something that just like released from that.
That's amazing. We were
Yeah.
just talking about
Anyways,
forgiveness earlier.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you for sharing. I'm glad this is helping you process in
Thank you,
real
thank you.
time.
This is a real time
We are
counseling session.
imperfect people, always on the journey, which is the beauty of life. Yeah, anyway, when I think about my high school experience, I remember many moments where I would also go in these mental spirals of like, how come my life doesn't look like this person or that popular, person or like
Mm,
this group of people. And I felt like the outcast and oftentimes didn't feel like I fit anywhere or was like fully belonged anywhere. So like these feelings are actually quite normal in terms of like adolescence, growing up and coming of age, that age. But again, because I didn't have anyone talking to me about how normal this is and I didn't have any safe space to process all this, I just literally like held it in and it would just cause me to mental spiral. And also on top of that, like really rough situations at home with a lot of fighting, a lot of like disorder and chaos at home. So I think a lot of Asian families, especially, they're not really attuned to like emotional well-being or regulation. So if parents don't know how to emotionally regulate, the children don't know either. I only just copied what I knew subconsciously. I was just like repeating basically what I saw growing up, either explode like holding everything in and then exploding, or just like stuffing everything down to the point where I was repressed basically and I didn't even know it. And I would try to like cover it up with like achievements and like doing a bunch of extracurriculars and being really nice to everyone, and looking back, I didn't even know I was doing that as a coping mechanism, but I really feel like it was a way to kind of cover up the pain rather than deal with it.
that's good.
And yeah, honestly, I can relate too with even like suicide ideation. Like I would have thoughts, first of all, running away from home. Like again, I feel like I saw too many movies about that where like kids would run away and I'm like, what if I ran away? I would have situations that were so hopeless to me back then that I felt like there's just no way out of this. Like I would rather just
Mm,
not be here. And honestly, I thought that was normal because again, no one talked to me about it. So
yeah.
yeah, it wasn't until later I was like, oh, this is probably like kind of concerning. And then one other incident was in college. So I would say I had like ups and flows of this. Like I wasn't like constantly in depression, but like it would like get better in certain seasons and then other seasons it would come up again where certain, I guess, situations or just kind of like what you were saying, like sometimes it's not even, you can't explain anything that triggers it necessarily. It's just like a feeling that all of a sudden comes out of nowhere. And we'll talk more about like why that is. But for me in college, I specifically remember senior year, I was definitely like, I think it was spring of senior year. I shared with a couple friends because I was like, I am just feeling so off. Like I feel so not myself. It's almost like this out of body experience. I don't know why. Like nothing specifically has happened that's made me this way, but I basically started to recognize like, oh, I think this is what depression really is. Cause it's like
Mm,
it's a difference between feeling depressed about something, like you're sad or disappointed or something
mm,
happened that makes you feel that way versus I literally couldn't explain why. I was just like I had no appetite, like I wasn't eating, and that's very weird for me because I love food. I wasn't sleeping or actually no, I slept too much. Like I would sleep really early, which is also very weird for me because I would
you would
usually
not sleep early.
yeah, I'm usually a night owl. I'm usually like, let me just sleep late and I didn't really prioritize sleep. But then I started sleeping a lot, not having motivation to like talk to people, hang out with people, which was also weird. So just like a lot of like these uncharacteristic things that puzzled me. And so I shared with a few friends about this. No one really had solutions for me, but it was at least
What?
nice to let it out.
I'm curious to hear, what did your friends say? How did they
Oh
respond?
yeah. I don't remember specifics. I just remember feeling thankful that they were accepting of me and just create a safe space to listen. They didn't really have solutions per se. Besides I'll be praying for you, and if you want to talk about more, like we can talk more. But yeah, I feel like that in itself was already like really helpful for me, knowing that I'm not
Yeah,
rejected
you're
for it.
seen, you're understood.
Yes. And then the last part of this is like basically it was interesting because I think actually I relate with you in terms of I don't know if there was anything specific that actually helped me out of it besides I just remember feeling a lot better like by the end of that semester. And then what's interesting was I had this very like I would say it was a divine encounter with this freshman girl who was part of like the fellowship I was in, and I usually don't talk to her, like we never hung out ever, but I just happened to see her and I don't know, I just felt this tug to like talk with her, like spend time to talk with her. I could have just like said oh hi and then just went on my way, but I felt like I should sit down and like talk with her. And so we sat down like in the middle of the plaza, and I asked her like how she's doing, and she literally just confessed. She was like sharing, I am depressed, like I don't know how to get out of this, and
Oh, wow.
I'm just like in a funk. It's really weird. And basically everything that I had just gone through, she was describing back to me. So in that moment, I just had this like light bulb go off in my head of like, oh, I think one of the reasons maybe why God allowed me to go through that was because now as I'm listening to this girl share about her experience, I actually know what she's talking about versus in the
Mm,
past I would be like, what, just like
like, get over it.
yeah, just get, don't be sad. Like, why do you need to be sad about things?
That's what
Like,
my mom would say.
yeah, like, because that's what we were taught. So I didn't know how to empathize with people with depression until I actually went through it myself.
Mm,
So in that moment, I just had so much empathy and compassion for her. I prayed for her. I sat with her, and I'm really grateful because in that moment, it was so powerful for me to be like, oh, there is a reason for everything, even if it's really hard in the moment.
yeah. Wow.
But
Man, I feel like high school and college, it's like the highest highs and lowest lows.
yes, and I feel
And
like there needs to be more support geared towards like youth, like teenagers, especially where you have all these mixed feelings. You're so confused about everything, and
yeah,
most people
yeah.
don't know how to navigate it well.
And people are lost in faith too. Like, that's
Yeah.
when a lot of people just kind of drift away from Jesus or towards Jesus. I'm fortunate that I drifted towards Jesus, but even then there's still challenges after that.
Yeah. And there's challenges that goes on, in adulthood too. So
Yeah, like until we die or when
right.
Jesus comes back.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to talk about the myths of depression because I feel like there's a lot of even unspoken myths that not many people talk about.
Yeah.
Well, this topic in general is not talked about often unless you're like in a counseling office or
Yeah. It's kind of taboo. Like people don't really talk about it, especially in Christian circles, because it's like just pray harder. Like you
pray
just
harder, have joy in the
yeah.
Lord. Don't you have the fruit of the
Yeah,
spirit?
exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I
but
think there's almost a shame of like if I even talk about depression, people are gonna look down on me and be like, pray more and root yourself in God more.
yeah,
Which yeah, that is true in terms of our everybody should be growing in God. But
just because it's true doesn't always mean it's helpful.
ooh, that's yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Add that in the
Anyway,
captions.
yeah, let's
Okay.
debunk some myths.
Yes, yes. First myth is depression is caused by a difficult situation. It can be caused by a difficult situation like mine. I know now it
Underlying
unrooted a lot of underlying feelings
belief
and
systems.
even traumas I had, belief systems I had growing up, but it's not always that way. Depression is very nuanced, it's very complex, and humans are very complex as well. And so it's not always caused by a difficult situation. And in Grace's case, it kind of descended on you. Um,
Which let's talk about that because I think
yeah.
from a non-Christian's perspective, they don't talk about the spiritual component, which is very key because I feel like, God made us as holistic beings, like with everything integrated, emotional, spiritual, mental, relational, everything, physical, everything ties together. If you grow up in culture and you're surrounded by people who are just talking about the emotional, the mental part, we are missing out on the spiritual part as well, which is very real, like demonic forces and the way that the enemy literally targets your mind. Like your mind is one of the biggest ways that the enemy stops you. It's not even due to circumstances. It's like your beliefs, your doubts, your fears, your anxieties. And like when I look back, I can't, I can't pinpoint and know exactly, but I feel very strongly that there was a part of that that was like a demonic, like like the enemy trying to stop me from pursuing God. And like I don't know, just I had a lot of things happening in that season where I was like trying to pursue, I was trying to run after God and the things that he had for me. And I feel like when the enemy sees that you're doing that, he's like, let me do everything I can to like stop you. So we just can't ignore that there's also like a spiritual component to it that we can't just like overlook, basically.
Yeah, yeah, you said it. Spiritual, it's the unseen realm, psychological, biochemical. There's a lot of things that play into it. Also, the world is just very crazy these days. There's a lot
Yeah,
of things
a lot
coming
of
at
stuff.
you from
Hmm.
social media, like doom scrolling and just, it's just like an atmosphere of, I don't know, like heaviness or burden.
And more access to that too. Like in the
Yeah,
past, you would have to turn on the TV to hear the news or like have a radio. But now it's like you literally have all the tragedies in the world like in your pocket.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And even with social media, it's an echo chamber. So if you like click on like something related to something, and then it's gonna just feed you more of that information. So literally, it is an echo chamber. All this to say, the myth is depression doesn't always come from a situation.
I think you meant the myth is it comes from a situation, but the truth is it doesn't always come from a situation. But it's complicated because there are situations that are triggering or amplifying these feelings of being depressed.
Yes, she said it way better than I did.
Okay. It's like the double negatives, like it's very confusing.
Yeah.
We just want to remind you one more time to enter the giveaway on our Instagram to win one of 3 signed books from Natasha Smith. The book is called Can You Just Sit With Me? And it's all about how to grieve healthily while at the same time trusting God and bringing Him the fullness of your emotions and connecting with what you're going through. And it's such a powerful book. I can't recommend it enough. So make sure, again, that you enter on our Instagram. The myth number 2 is that having depression means you don't have enough faith.
Ooh, let's break that down.
This is what we were alluding to earlier, which is like oftentimes in the church, especially if people aren't very familiar with like mental health, emotional health. Now, more and more, thankfully, we have more education around. But like spiritually speaking, a lot of people are like, oh, you just have to pray harder or like have more faith. And it can get really frustrating for some people who are just doing that and are not seeing results necessarily. And they're like, why? Like, how, like, do I not have enough faith? And it becomes like this shame spiral.
It also doesn't mean that God does not love you.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
feel like
Yes.
our faith can be tied to our circumstances and how we're feeling. And I can imagine many people feeling that way, that, oh, God must abandon me or not. He
Right.
must have forgotten about me and doesn't see the details. And, you can help but feel abandoned when that happens.
Yeah,
And
like, it makes you question if God loves you as much as, like, other people who aren't going through the same thing, or at least
yeah, yeah, yeah. People probably think like, oh, I'm doing all this, I'm praying, I'm fasting, and I do all the like the spiritual stuff, right? But why do I feel this way still?
right? Which is again, we're not saying, like, prayer is not important, like, it really, really is.
Oh yeah, yeah, we pray.
Yeah,
just so just
we pray.
just for the record.
Yeah. We're just addressing the myth of, like, it's purely, like, just you just need to know more scripture, you just need to pray harder, and it's just so much more nuanced than that. Like, I think oftentimes we forget that, again, maybe because we're seeing things on social media or in the media in general of, like, "Oh, I need to be, like, so happy all the time, so joy-filled, not go through any hardship, mentally speaking," and so then when we start going through these challenges mentally, we're like, "Oh,
Hmm.
I'm not doing it right," you know? So it's just unrealistic expectations, but it really is part of being human is going through the ups and downs. And we'll talk about like how we see this in the Bible too, and how we see it even in heroes of faith, you know? It's a challenge that really anybody, even people who are full of faith, deal with. And I would say a lot of even pastors and people in ministry deal with as well. They just don't share about it openly because it's very vulnerable to talk about.
It's super vulnerable, and it just affects your leadership.
But then they
But
pence it
then,
up and or
yeah,
anybody who pence it up is it leaks out, in
yeah.
unhealthy ways.
Yes, definitely. Myth number 3: depression is just something you have to live with that can never go away. We don't operate in human logic, but we operate through the Holy Spirit, and anything is possible. And even Jesus said, what is impossible with man is possible with God. And there's countless examples of stories in the Bible that God does the impossible. And there's still miracles and just amazing things that happen even today. So we definitely believe it is possible.
Just going back again to the lens of like culture and the non-Christian Christian perspective, of course you would feel like this is impossible because you're limited by your own means. But as believers, if we really believe that God is who he says he is, like he can split the Red Sea. Like we were just talking about this earlier at church. It's like he can do the things that by human means you would not be able to do. And so as believers, we have a totally different operating system by which we're believing in God for, So that includes breakthrough over these mental, emotional, very complex challenges that most of the world would probably say, oh, it's an ongoing thing. You just have to like live with it. As believers, we're going to be bold enough to believe it is possible. It doesn't mean God will, immediately grant you freedom, but that he can. Anything that's difficult in life, or even like
Hmm.
a disability, even like an injury or yeah,
Yeah.
just suffering in general, God sometimes will allow those things to happen, but then he always can use it and like redeem it for his glory and his purposes.
Yeah.
So whether it is like building your empathy for like people who go through that same thing, and then you actually become a more powerful and effective minister to those people, or it's like so many other possibilities. But I definitely think nothing is a waste in God's eyes.
Anyways, we're going to dive deep into the history of depression.
We're not experts. We're just going to cover this really high level, and I'll try my best to articulate this. I was doing a lot of deep research about depression because I feel like there's just different ways when you're talking about something and how to overcome it. It's so important to firstly understand like what you're talking about and be on the same page about it. The reality is just the way that we now modern day people define and think about depression is super different from like historically how it's been referred to or understood. And so even that is like very complicated, because I was just thinking actually earlier, like how we have social media, for example. So we have these like social media specific challenges now that if you talk to someone 100 years ago about these challenges about social media, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't understand what you're saying, right? Or like even traffic, like right now we have like cars and like we have road rage. Like, would people 200, 300 years ago understand like road rage and GPS struggles like this? So like
It's me.
yeah.
Maybe AI will take over.
Okay, that's another rabbit hole.
That's
But
enough.
no, I was just thinking like there's like unique challenges and circumstances in every era and every century and generation.
Hmm.
And we have to think across generations of how things that we understand today are just so different from a perspective of many, many years ago. So, in terms of the concept of clinical depression as we understand it today, it actually, when you think about that, it didn't exist during the biblical times because they didn't have all this like psychotherapy, like psychoanalysis, and all the science and the tools and technology that they had, that we have today. So, it's actually very difficult. And I don't think it's our place to really accurately define or diagnose depression in terms of historical figures back then, in terms of modern psychological terms, because this modern understanding really has only developed in the last 2 centuries, people say. Now we have like manuals, we have like criteria that really defines this as clinical depression. There's also so many different kinds of depression and
Hmm.
disorders. What we understand it as is clinical depression is characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, a lack of interest or pleasure, changes in your appetite, sleeplessness or sleep disturbances, extreme fatigue and exhaustion. The thing is, just because we can't diagnose historical or biblical figures with the modern day definition of depression, though,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean though that we can't learn from the biblical figures and the people in history who have dealt with still really difficult emotional mental challenges.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about like what we see in the Bible, but even across like Greek, Roman, Chinese, like Asian cultures, there's actually a lot of references in historical writings about emotional distress, about affliction, anguish, melancholy, despair, like these
Hmm.
terms that people use, whether or not it was like actual like clinical depression, they still use to describe the sense of really dark emotional despair and that psychological turmoil that they had. It was only due to like advances in neuroscience, study of brain chemistry, and all of the science that we have today, that now we have so much more vocabulary and understanding of like where a lot of the symptoms or the roots of those feelings come from. And then, yeah, again, as believers, we also recognize there are spiritual elements and forces that also play a factor into it. So, all that to say is it's not just one or the other, like, oh, the historical one is right or the modern day one is right. It's just like a different lens through which to think about it and recognize that there's a lot we can learn from people in history who've talked about this and their lives. But at the end of the day, it is all the neuroscience, but it's also all the spiritual, emotional, mental, physical stuff all combined, because we're holistic human beings. I
Definitely.
hope that made sense.
That made total sense, babe.
Okay. This is really complicated to describe, but
Wow, takes me back to my college psychology classes.
yeah, I love psychology class actually.
Yeah, me too. It
Yeah.
was my favorite
Yeah.
AP class.
Same.
So, question for myself and to the listeners: is there depression in the Bible? Hmm. Good question. Good question. So,
Self-dialogue.
we are a self-dialoguing couple here. Depression in the Bible, it's hard to say because what Grace said, instead of that, the Bible does acknowledge the reality of human suffering and emotional struggles that we can understand. Some of it does have depressive qualities, but we're not here to say, oh, this person has depression,
We're not here to diagnose.
unless we like transport back to the future and use modern technology and all that stuff, which we can't do. But we can find solace and comfort just in what the characters in the Bible have suffered and have gone through. And there's a lot of people in scripture that have gone through very difficult things. So we're not alone. We can share with you a few biblical heroes as well. David, he wrote about 50% of Psalms, and you can see that he's really raw. He's authentic in his expressions of pain and sorrow, especially as he's escaping from death from Saul. But he also finds comfort in God. Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, and he's also known as the weeping prophet, and he just expressed really, really deep grief. You have Job. A lot of us know Job as someone who's just went through immense suffering. He had his family killed, destroyed, lost everything, and still he finds a lot of comfort in God as well towards the end of Job. And then there's Elijah in First Kings 19. Right after Elijah prays for rain, he gets a death threat and is so afraid and distressed that he flees into the wilderness and asks God to take his life too.
Yeah, I think he said it's better if I was like never born or something like that. And
Yeah. So
he was really in a deep, dark spot.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think one person I feel like epitomizes this also is even Jesus himself, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's like crying out, like praying and like asking God, like, take this cup, the cup being like his suffering and what's to come. He was sweating like drops of blood, it says in the Bible. And so I feel like that's another picture of like even Jesus himself, like he knew what's gonna happen. He knew it was for God's glory, like, but he didn't like cover it up with toxic positivity. I'm like, oh, it's okay, it's gonna be fine. Like I'm just gonna suffer. It's gonna be fine. Like he was honest with those emotions and very raw with God about he doesn't know. This is very difficult for him.
It's very difficult. I don't want to do this, but I will do it
Right.
because
Out
I'm
of
convicted.
obedience.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
So some other significant people in history, we'll just go through this list that we were looking up, or I've heard too about Mother Teresa herself, who's known to be super, spiritual and does so many philanthropic, that's a hard word to say, philanthropic stuff for people in need and communities in need. She herself actually, after her death, people saw in her journal, she had so many journal entries about feeling really like depressed and this darkness and even feeling abandoned by God. She said she felt a sense of emptiness and was just struggling with her relationship with God, which was very surprising because you wouldn't be able to tell on the outside. Charles Spurgeon, Martin Luther, C.S. Lewis, these are all very famous and well-known Christian authors and leaders. C.S. Lewis himself actually wrote about his struggles with grief and depression, especially after his wife Joy had died, which is, I feel like that's a little ironic. But yeah, it is very interesting because in his works in like Narnia and just all his writings, like you're like, oh, this guy is so faithful. Like he's so, he must have everything together. But in his writings, it's like so vulnerable. The last thing I'll mention is Charles Spurgeon described his doubts and depressions as a black dog that always haunted him. He wrote like so many amazing things. He was known as the Prince of Preachers, and a lot of pastors, ministers look up to him. But even he himself had this, what he called a black dog, always haunting him. Not to say like they had this all the time, but it's just, I think it's very comforting to find that other people, even the most faith-filled, even the most like amazing people in history who are heroes like this, also struggled a lot with emotional mental health too.
Regardless of whether you feel a sense of depression or not, it doesn't mean that God loves you any less. It also doesn't mean that God is any less faithful to you. Psalm 23 says, God's love and faithfulness pursues you all the days of your life. And yeah, it's just so beautiful. But often I know listeners and viewers here do get that sense that because I feel this way, because I'm just like so down and circumstances aren't like aligning with what I want, it can definitely feel like, yeah, I am abandoned or God's forgotten me. He's not into the details. So I just want to put like a stamp on that again, because it's so important.
And like normalize that to say like you're never too far from God. Like even if you're feeling those things, even if you're feeling abandoned and doubtful, like Mother Teresa felt that too. So it's like
Mm.
I think when we get trapped in spirals with shame of like I shouldn't feel this way, that like creates even more repression of the emotions rather than letting out our honest emotions and finding healing through that.
Yeah, and we shouldn't expect life to be all dandy because God says that you will have trials, persecutions, struggles in this life. The only time when we won't is when Jesus comes back, and that will be a glorious day, or when we go into eternity. Anyways, I want to share some verses about what I just said about you possibly feeling unlovable or just abandoned. 2 Corinthians 4 verses 8 to 9 says, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed." He's talking to the church of Corinth. "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me.'"
We talk a lot about that second verse in our podcast, I feel. It's just such a good, it's like encapsulates it's okay to be weak because God actually designed you to depend on him. And so through your weakness, that's where his power and his glory shines the most.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like that's very pertinent to this topic, especially like if you're feeling down or you feel like, oh, I'm like not chipper and I'm not blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's okay. Like God actually, in a way, like designed you to feel all the ups and downs as a human being so that you depend on him. You're not just like a self-sufficient, I don't need God. I'm okay. Like he uses these things, these opportunities as ways to draw us closer to him and deepen our relationship with him and our foundation in him. Just to wrap up, because this is a lot to talk about, and actually next week we're going to talk about 5 key ways and like practical tips to overcome that has helped us, but also that we found to be just helpful in general when you're going through either depression or just like really, really hard emotional trials. We'll talk about that next week, but this week we'll just wrap up with there's a lot of gifts and blessings that come out of struggles, trials, but 2 main ones we want to call out is number 1, the raw and authentic expression of emotion helps us to actually connect so powerfully and deeply with God in ways that we actually couldn't when everything's good. Like when everything's good, you're like, oh, okay, I'm just like going about my day and my daily life, like enjoying it. But it's actually when you like are at the end of your rope, you have nowhere else to go. Like God uses that as a way for us to be like, God, I need you. Like I know I need you, and it humbles us. It draws us to him. It allows us to recognize his power that only he has that we can't do on our own. So in the midst of the despair, it creates this intimacy. And I felt that too. I've talked about this before in Australia when I was feeling so lonely. And I was like, God, what the heck? Like you sent me here. I thought it was going to be so fun. And it was fun in many ways, but I was so lonely. And it was in that season that I just felt this intimacy with God I had never experienced before, because before I didn't feel that loneliness. So I was like, oh, I just have friends and I have community and it's like all good. But in Australia, like he really, really met me so powerfully.
I will also say that it's up to us as well. It's two-way. Like God can use it if you're willing to be humble and willing to go with the flow of the process.
Yeah, to lean in rather than walk away or run
Hmm.
away. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, just like any invitation. Like if I invited you to like a party or something and then you're like, no thanks. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
you're
Exactly.
lost. But the second thing is spiritual growth and resilience. And it's actually funny. I feel like this connects with the message from church earlier today about the long way. I've been meditating on that a lot, about how when the Israelites were freed from Egypt, from slavery, God literally took them the long way instead of like the short way. I really feel like that also pertains in a lot of ways to even our struggles, like emotionally, mentally, because a lot of the times we have to go through that long way of there's suffering, there's trials, but it actually creates in us this resilience and growth and foundation of faith that again we otherwise wouldn't have if we didn't. And a lot of the times those are the things that make us stronger. Those are the things that make us more able to then steward the gifts and the blessings that God wants to bestow on us. And oftentimes we're just like, oh, we just want the easy way, we want the comfort, because that's what the world tells us is a way to do it. But you can ask any like health professional or expert, they're always like, comfort actually cripples you because it creates this complacency or this weakening of your muscles, and it's only through the trials that you actually get stronger. And the way that God does that is part of the sanctification that he desires for us.
Yeah. It's kind of like working out.
Yeah,
Your
exactly.
muscles need to tear.
Yeah.
in order for them to get stronger and for you to get stronger.
Yeah. Whenever I'm sore after our workouts, Alex is like, "That's so great. Your muscles are tearing."
It doesn't sound it doesn't sound pleasant, but there is a wonderful reward at the end.
Just to recap, the three myths that we talked about, or I guess the truths to the myths, is that number one, depression is not necessarily caused by a situation. Number two is depression also isn't necessarily a lack of faith. And number three is depression can be overcome with God's power. And especially if you're a believer and you follow Jesus, you have the living God inside of you. You have the spirit inside of you. And that gives us so much more access and authority than we even realize. So if you're watching on video, you will see that my hair is a little wet. I came out of the shower not too long ago. Sorry for the awkward transition for those who are listening, but I felt so compelled to replace the end segment that we had originally recorded for this because it made so much sense in my head in the shower. Like all the dots were just connecting. And between the time when we recorded that episode and now, it hasn't been that long, maybe like a week and a half ish. I felt disappointed with it. I was like not satisfied because, and I rarely feel that way. To that degree about our episodes, but I was like, I just don't know like if we achieved the goal we wanted to achieve, which was to help people feel compassion and comfort and hope and encouragement and love. There's multiple factors, but one major one was that I feel like it, to a degree, me and Alex have been like so far removed from, I mean, we did walk through it, but we talked about high school and college, and it's been a while since then. And then also like our doubting phases, that we talked about, I think in episode, I want to say 28, about doubt and losing our faith and being really depressed, and all that stuff is really real and really hard, and we walk through it. But I almost felt this feeling of like, it's kind of like an old person telling a young person like, oh yeah, I went through that, and oh, it's gonna be okay, and like, oh, it's just this, and don't worry, like I personally kind of had that feeling, and I was like, oh, I hope it would suck if people listen to this and kind of feel like, oh yeah, that sounds nice, but it's not really connecting with me, versus someone who like just went through it recently and can really, really feel, it's really hard, And so very ironically, I feel like the timing was not on accident. A few days before, I experienced something that I didn't think I would experience in a long time, which was, there's like a bunch of, I'm not going to go into details because it's too much, but it's like a bunch of stuff happened, a bunch, like not just one or two or three, is like maybe 5, 6, 7 things all happened that were all stacked up and culminating. And I was like, what is happening? Like all these things are coming out of nowhere, and they're all related to like very deep-seated wounds that I know I have, that I've thankfully God's helped me heal. But it's just like any wound that heals, like there's still a scar, or there's still like a tenderness sometimes. Looking back, it's like, oh, I really can see like the enemy knows it's like one thing isn't just enough to like hurt that place anymore. Like I can manage that pretty well, but when it's like a lot of things at once, it's like, okay, ow, like that actually really hurts. Basically the metaphor was for what happened was that, because I went down this spiral that I was like, what is happening right now? I literally, me and Alex just talked about depression, just talked about despair. We know all these things in our heads intellectually about what it is, why it's happening, spiritual, biological, chemically. But I felt so just in a state of despair and hopelessness that I haven't felt in a very, very long time. I was just sitting there like, I know all this, that this is not from God. I know that I have wounds and triggers. I know like this is my inner child needing healing. I know blah blah blah, like I know, but it's like it's something you can't really explain or like reason out. It's just like an emotional, spiritual battle. It's really hard. And I think also one side note is I also learned people with ADHD tend to have more depressive thoughts because apparently negative thoughts are more stimulating for the mind, and ADHD people tend to like gravitate and hang on to those more. So anyway, I knew all these things, but I was like, okay, I don't need this. This is like debilitating me from doing the work that God is calling me to do and living my life and serving people and stuff. But yeah, I honestly, looking back, I'm like, oh, I really feel like God allowed me, similar to what I said earlier in the podcast episode about allowing me to go through depression in college to minister to that girl, a freshman, about it. I was like, I wouldn't be surprised if God allowed me to go through this right now, because he wants me to share this with whoever's listening who's going through it right now too, which is, the biggest thing isn't even like understanding what to do or intellectually what's going on. Like the biggest thing that helped me, when I was going through this literally just recently, was when Alex actually continued to love me in spite of my mess. And okay, anyone who is single looking for that future spouse, like both me and Alex are huge proponents and believers in this, but really prioritize finding someone who loves God genuinely and who also reflects God's love, not perfectly, but reflects God's love in ways that you're like, oh, that's how God loves, like that you can recognize those marks. And I honestly have experienced so much of that through our marriage, but especially in the lowest of lows, when I felt I was just like, I'm a mess, I'm a disappointment, like why, like and again, I know that intellectually these thoughts are not aligned with God's truth of like being a disappointment or failure or, falling short. But all these thoughts were getting triggered because of the multitude of triggers that the enemy was stacking against me. Now I can see very clearly about that. But in the moment, it was like foggy. It was like haze. I was like, I just feel so low and I don't know how to explain it. Like, I know everything I should know about it, but emotionally, I just feel so hopeless. And it's like this huge, vast, gaping hole in between your intellect and emotions. You always come out the other side being like, thank God I, pushed through and didn't do anything that I would regret forever. But yeah, I just felt so loved when Alex just continued to embrace me, to let me, just be a mess and not put these expectations on me to function as I normally should, that I tend to put on myself. And he also would say like, it's okay to cry. And like, even though I just felt like unworthy, and I don't know, like I don't want to burden him with my pain and my mess. Like maybe I should just like create distance, between us. He still fought to make sure I knew that he loves me. That's what people, if you're going through depression right now, I think that's what you really need to hear, and hopefully will speak to you, is you are just as worthy and loved in your mess as you are at your best. And even though you're going through something that is so hard and so dark, and all the things, you know all the truths, but there's still this internal war and conflict, just keep hanging on, keep pressing through, because it truly gets better on the other side. And I was like, oh, I think there's a big reason why I went through that for such a time as this. But if you're going through something like that, whether it is depression or something else, I think that's the biggest thing, is to know that it's okay to not be okay. Like sometimes it's sometimes we're like, oh, we gotta fix it, we gotta like find the solution right away. And honestly, sometimes we just need to let it out. We need to let out our grief and our emotions and our tears instead of bottling them up. And that's what happened to me. Was I was just crying out to God. I was just crying out just about these grievances that I had, that I still have, and just processing it, not in a very neat way, to be honest, but just pouring my heart out to God. And that helped immensely to release that to God, while at the same time like being reassured that I'm still lovable, I'm still worthy. There's a place for grieving, and we talked about this last week actually, and it's actually really helpful to just let it out, just cry it out. Even though it's messy, you might not even know what to say, just cry it out to God, and it helps release so much burden that I feel like we subconsciously hold in, thinking, I should be okay with this now, I should be fine. And so yeah, I don't know if this made like a lot of cohesive sense, but I just felt really strongly to share that even when you're on the other side for so long, it can still come up sometimes. Try your best to surround yourself with people who will reflect God's love to you and his compassion to you, and also pour your heart out to God, because he cares for you. It's literally in God's word, cast your anxieties to him. He cares for us. And if you know someone going through depression or just struggling and don't really know how to help them, because oftentimes actually like trying to help too much creates even more anxiety and shame, like, oh, because I'm going through this, other people feel like they need to help me. And it's like sometimes space is actually really good. I think one of the best ways is just to pray for that person, but really pray and ask God for discernment on like what to do and how to do it, and let go of the results. Like, if we're all imperfect people, so we talk about this in the grief episode last week. We talk about we're not always going to be perfect in helping each other or asking for help, but what we can do is ask God for wisdom and just trust him in it and lean on his grace for the places that we fall short. I hope that this is a bit more relatable to anyone who is going through it or knows someone who's going through it, and just know it's okay. God is with you and it's going to be better. Just keep hanging on, keep going. This is is not the end of the story. We'll see you again next week for more on this topic.